Alright, AP Psych friends, we are in our final video for Unit 6 on learning. This is the video on cognitive theories. And so, to look at learning and cognition, before we talk about latent learning, let's review why we even need a third theory of learning. And that was in the end of our discussion of operant conditioning when we were talking about the weaknesses of associative learning theories like classical and operant conditioning. Classical and operant conditioning, remember, are the behaviors theory. They're very scientific in their explanation of how organisms learn, that primarily we are reacting to our environment, and regardless of what we're associating, whether it be stimulus like in classical conditioning, or it be action consequence like it is in operant conditioning, the point being there's not a lot of personal mental processes involved in either of those types of learning. And so here it is. The cognitive revolution of the 1960s brings you this final theory of learning. And so there's two main examples under the cognitive theory of learning. The first is latent learning. And if you remember from Unit 5, latent is a word that means hidden, as in when we were talking about the Freudian wish fulfillment theory of dreams, we said that latent content of dreams was the hidden or underlying meaning of your dream. And so latent learning is just information or learning that remains hidden until it's needed. The person that does the most famous experiment concerning latent learning is Edward Tolman. What Edward Tolman does is he actually has two mazes that are identical and two rats, neither of which have been trained to run the maze. Rat A is taught to run the maze successfully using traditional operant conditioning techniques. All right, a primary positive reinforcer of food is placed at every correct turn. Right, we have some shaping happening. Right, maybe towards the end of the training, there's only food at the end of the maze. Regardless, rat being conditioned or trained to find its way through the maze. While this is occurring, rat B is just left to lollygag about the other yet identical maze, just to explore on its own free will. And prior to cognitive theories of learning, most people would have just assumed that the only rat that learned anything in this situation was rat A, the one that had been trained or conditioned to learn. But what Tolman actually found is that when you placed both rats at the start of their maze and placed food at the end of both mazes, and then left the rats to run the maze, both rats could find the end just as quickly. And so that rat that had been just kind of hanging out in the maze and exploring on its own free will clearly must have learned some information. And so latent learning, sometimes we talk about these cognitive maps inside of our minds, and that that rat didn't maybe even realize that it had learned its way through the maze until it was put in a situation where it could receive positive reinforcement for doing it, and then it amazingly enough could rely on previous learning. And so that's one example of the cognitive theory of learning. The other very famous example of it is observational learning, or social learning. And we had 40 studies reading over the summer over observational learning. Remember, the person that did that was Albert Bandura. And so what's happening with observational learning is that we know there are lots of examples in our own lives and in psychological research where people learn things because they have modeled the behavior of others, right? And so it's possible to learn things not because you experienced any sort of associative learning yourself, but simply because you've watched somebody else do a behavior and you're imitating them. That's called modeling. How does this work? Mirror neurons, primarily found in the frontal lobe, we have seen on PET scans and MRI scans, actually firing in response to a person doing a behavior, and firing in response to a person watching someone else do that same behavior. And so sometimes when we watch people do things, our brain is using the same neural pathways as it does when we ourselves do that same behavior. And so watching by imitating or modeling, we actually name the neurons mirror neurons, for as if a mere reflection of what we see. Mirror neurons are probably the reason that humans have the ability to empathize with others. Why when you see a friend crying as a result of a death in their family, you can legitimately feel sad too, feel sad for them. You can kind of wince in pain as you watch somebody get stabbed in a horror film. Those are the mirror neurons, like allowing you to in some way experience something that you yourself haven't physically done. Bandura's experiment, if you remember from the 40 Studies reading, was the Bobo the Clown experiment, where Bandura had a large inflatable Bobo doll, and then showed children a video of adults beating and punching and kicking the Bobo doll, and then gave the children an opportunity to play with toys. And sure enough, children that had been shown the violent Bobo video, if you recall from your reading, those were the ones that would treat the doll in the same violent way. And so remember that the significance is that Bandura's experiments are the ones that have been cited by lots of parent advocate groups concerning movie ratings, video game ratings, TV show ratings, that children especially have a very sensitive nature to absorbing what it is they see others doing. All right, so some applications of this. Look, the cognitive theory of either latent learning, cognitive maps, or observational social learning. These explain a lot of instances of learning in your life. Think of any, like random piece of information that simply just because you thought it was interesting, never were reinforced to learn that piece of information, yet that cognitive map was there. And so you're, watching a trivia competition and magically you know an answer to something you didn't know you knew the answer to. In observational learning, we can talk about the pro-social and anti-social effects. That most toddlers and babies pick up a lot of socialization simply by mimicking what they see or practicing what they see other people do. And the flip side of that is the antisocial effects, in that we can teach people bad things by watching bad or antisocial behavior. And so the impressionable nature of the young mind is something to keep in mind, in that the modeling that we do for these people, for these kids, is really important. And so most students don't seem to have a problem with this theory of learning. It's easier than the other two. It's less scientific. It's more intuitive. But of course, bring any questions that you have about it to class with you. And as always, thanks for listening.